In the spring of 1827, a woman appeared on the narrow, winding trails of eastern Kentucky, carrying 3 infants swaddled in threadbare blankets. She walked with the kind of purpose that drew the attention of the few families who lived in the sparse settlements along Breath County, yet discouraged them from approaching. She was thin, severe, and unyielding, with dark hair pulled tight against her skull, and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. She introduced herself simply as Delilah Ballard, widow of a traveling preacher named Jacob Ballard, who she claimed had died somewhere in Tennessee from a fever. Delilah accepted no assistance, offered no explanation for her journey, and made clear that she sought no friendship, no community, and no interference in her affairs. The hollow she chose as her home lay 13 miles from the county seat of Jackson, accessible only by a treacherous footpath too narrow and rough for wagons. The hollow sat in a natural bowl formed by limestone cliffs, which rose nearly vertical on 3 sides. Mist and fog pooled in the depression, thick as wool, lingering well past sunrise. A creek ran through the hollow, swift and cold even in the heat of summer, cutting through rock worn smooth by centuries of water. In winter, snow blocked the path for weeks, and even experienced hunters avoided the area. The terrain alone offered a veil of isolation that few outsiders could penetrate. Delilah began constructing a cabin immediately, working through the summer and fall of 1827. The logs were felled and stacked with meticulous care, forming a crude but substantial structure. The foundation sunk deep into the hillside, and a root cellar that extended into the limestone beneath suggested preparation for long-term seclusion. She planted no crops that anyone could observe and kept no livestock that could be heard. Trips to Jackson for supplies were limited to a single visit each autumn, during which she purchased salt, flour, and lamp oil in quantities far exceeding what a woman alone with 3 infants would need. Merchants recalled that she never explained her purchases, only producing coins from a worn leather pouch with a quiet certainty that seemed almost ritualistic. Local families soon regarded Delilah as a figure of legend rather than concern. Isolation was common among mountain dwellers, and those who sought it for religious or personal reasons were often left alone. Circuit preachers who attempted to visit her early on were turned away, Delilah standing in the path and declaring her family answered to God alone, requiring no earthly church. She refused to send her children to the community school, insisting that they be educated only from the scriptures she provided, lest they be corrupted by the outside world. By 1835, when the triplets would have been 9 years old, no one in Breath County had seen them clearly. Hunters occasionally glimpsed movement in the trees, figures too large to be deer, yet too quick to identify. Thomas Spencer, a farmer 5 miles away, once reported seeing 3 tall figures moving single file along a ridge at twilight, but failing light made details impossible to determine. His wife, Marianne, heard strange, almost animalistic voices echoing through the hollow one autumn morning, further deepening the sense of mystery surrounding the family. The community's understanding of Delilah's sons existed primarily through absence, through the awareness that 3 boys were growing in complete isolation, learning only what their mother chose to teach them. They were unknown, unobserved, and yet their presence loomed in the collective imagination of Breath County, as the hollow itself seemed a place apart from the world, untouched by ordinary human laws and expectations. By the early 1850s, the Ballard triplets emerged from the long shadows of their isolation as figures that seemed to belong more to folklore than reality. Raised entirely by Delilah, they had learned nothing of the world beyond Copperhead Hollow except what their mother dictated, which was almost entirely scripture, interpretation, and a rigid understanding of divine purpose. Hunters and trappers who ventured near the hollow began to report strange encounters. 3 towering men, each well over 7 feet tall, moving through the forest with an unsettling fluidity. Their footsteps were nearly silent, despite their massive frames, and they often appeared in the peripheral vision of travelers, vanishing the moment they were observed directly. Descriptions of their appearance heightened the sense of unease surrounding the hollow. Their clothing was homespun and ill-fitting, hanging awkwardly over bodies built heavy from years of labor in the mountains. Long, unkempt hair fell past their shoulders, framing faces that seemed almost too large for human features. When approached, the brothers did not meet the eyes of strangers, keeping their gazes fixed instead on the ground or middle distance. Communication, when it occurred at all, was through grunts and gestures, lending them an air of primitive otherness that unnerved even the hardiest mountain folk. The first documented encounter with outsiders occurred in October 1851. A merchant traveling from Jackson to Perry County came upon the three brothers standing motionless beside the trail near Copperhead Hollow. The men watched him with an intensity that made his skin crawl, turning their heads in unison as though tracking him with predatory precision. Yet they made no attempt to speak or approach, moving in a way that suggested perfect coordination. When the merchant finally called out a greeting, one brother let out a low sound, a noise that might have been speech, or something far less human. He later reported the encounter to Sheriff Nathaniel Combs, describing the uncanny symmetry and presence of the men, which seemed to signal not only physical dominance, but a strange, unsettling intelligence. As the years passed, women traveling mountain paths began reporting an increasing sense of being watched. Martha Hensley, a local woman traveling between her family's farm and Jackson in 1852, described glimpsing enormous figures in the trees near Copperhead Hollow. She could not discern their features, but she felt the weight of their attention, a deliberate observation that went beyond curiosity. Other women spoke of a similar experience, a feeling that eyes followed them with calculation, patience, and a focus that went beyond mere interest. The giants were always present yet elusive, operating in a liminal space where myth and reality overlapped, leaving only unease in their wake. The first disappearances, though not yet linked to the Ballards, occurred under circumstances the mountains themselves could easily claim as accidents. In September 1848, a widow named Elizabeth Halcombe vanished on a journey from Ossabaw County to Virginia. No trace of her was found along the treacherous paths she would have traveled, and the prevailing assumption was that she had fallen into the swift creek or slipped from the cliffs. 2 years later, Catherine Stidham, a midwife, disappeared under similar circumstances, and searches again yielded nothing. Each case was recorded as tragedy, misfortune, or the perilous nature of the terrain, never as the work of human hands. By 1852, these disappearances formed a pattern that no one yet recognized. Women traveling alone or with elderly companions vanished along routes near Copperhead Hollow. The events were spaced in time, creating the illusion of isolated tragedies rather than a connected series. Those who vanished came from different communities, their lives intersecting only through geography and circumstance, the hollow acting as a dark pivot around which these disappearances revolved. By the autumn of 1852, the pattern of disappearances began to draw the attention of a few seasoned mountain men. Josiah Fletcher, a hunting guide and tracker of mixed Cherokee and Scotch-Irish ancestry, had spent decades in Breath County and knew the paths, ridges, and hidden hollows as well as any local sheriff could. He noticed that only women seemed to vanish. Men traveling alone, elderly travelers, or groups of families completed their journeys safely, but women of child-bearing age, whether alone or accompanied by those too old or infirm to protect them, simply disappeared without trace. Fletcher kept an informal count in his mind, as a hunter observes shifts in game or tracks left in snow. By his reckoning, at least 6 women had vanished within the past 8 years on routes that passed near Copperhead Hollow. Fletcher shared his concerns during a chance meeting in Jackson with Sheriff Nathaniel Combs, a methodical man who had served as a military scout before taking the office in 1850. Combes prided himself on approaching mysteries with patience and evidence rather than assumption, understanding that a single misstep could cost both the investigator and the innocent. Fletcher's observations struck him immediately, not for the numbers themselves, but for the consistency of the pattern. All victims were women, all routes passed near a single, isolated hollow. All disappearances occurred in seasons when travel through the mountains was feasible. As Sheriff Combes began to review the missing person records, he uncovered cases that predated his tenure. By piecing together conversations with predecessors and examining county filings, he identified at least 9 disappearances, possibly as many as 12 if he included incidents reported privately or not formally documented. Each took place between late spring and early autumn, each victim a woman between 18 and 40, and each along paths that passed within a day's walk of Copperhead Hollow. The hollow, already shrouded in local legend and whispered warnings, now emerged as a point of concern rather than mere curiosity. The mountains themselves aided the concealment of the crimes. Copperhead Hollow's geography, with cliffs nearly vertical on 3 sides, thick fog that lingered for hours, and paths barely wide enough for a single traveler, made investigation extremely difficult. Winter snow could block access entirely, and swift creeks carved deep channels that could hide evidence indefinitely. Anyone unfamiliar with the region would be lost within hours, their cries swallowed by the hollow's isolation. Even experienced hunters and trappers avoided the area, guided more by instinct and caution than by formal warning. Yet despite the isolation, the Ballards were not invisible. Travelers reported fleeting encounters, long enough to note the size and strangeness of the men, but too brief for meaningful observation. Thomas Spencer recalled an incident in the summer of 1854, seeing the 3 brothers speaking with a woman on a trail near the hollow. They offered assistance, which the woman appeared to accept, nodding and gesturing politely. Spencer thought nothing of it at the time, dismissing it as ordinary mountain courtesy. But with the emerging pattern of disappearances, the interaction took on a far more sinister meaning. The sheriff realized he faced a unique challenge. He had a growing list of victims, witnesses who glimpsed giants in the mountains, and a hollow that offered almost complete concealment. Yet he lacked proof. No bodies, no confessions, no surviving witnesses. Any attempt to intervene prematurely could alert the Ballards, sending them deeper into the wilderness where discovery might never occur. Combes needed evidence concrete enough to justify an investigation, yet subtle enough to avoid immediate flight or retaliation from the isolated giants. By the autumn of 1856, the community's whispers of fear and the sheriff's careful scrutiny converged. Something dark and deliberate had taken root in the mountains, a series of crimes hidden by geography, timing, and fear, waiting for the first shred of tangible evidence to finally break the case open. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, not through methodical investigation, but through providence in the form of Reverend Micah Toiver, a circuit preacher of 36 years, unmarried and lean from constant travel. He had ridden the mountain routes of eastern Kentucky for over a decade. His circuit covered more than 150 miles of treacherous paths, requiring him to accept shelter wherever darkness or weather left him stranded. On the night of January 14th, 1857, he was traveling from a settlement in Perry County toward Jackson when a sudden blizzard descended with the brutal unpredictability that characterized these mountains. Visibility fell to near zero within an hour, and Toiver knew that continuing along the main trail would almost certainly lead to freezing to death before reaching any known shelter. He remembered vague stories of a widow and her sons living deep in Copperhead Hollow, the mysterious Ballard family whose reputation preceded them as much in rumor as in fact. The idea of seeking refuge there might have seemed reckless under ordinary circumstances, but Toiver understood the imperatives of survival. Following the creek that cut through the hollow, he carefully advanced through snow already ankle-deep, mindful of hidden crevices and treacherous footing. The hollow, when it emerged from the blowing snow, was as isolated and forbidding as he had imagined. Limestone cliffs loomed on three sides, fog clinging to their faces like a ghostly shroud, and the creek's waters ran swift and cold, the noise muted under the storm's white roar. By dusk, Toiver reached the Ballard cabin. Its scale immediately struck him as abnormal. The furniture seemed built for giants rather than ordinary men, chairs towering over him, a table so high it forced him to crane his neck. He called out, identifying himself as a preacher seeking emergency shelter. The door opened to reveal a tall, severe woman, her dark hair tightly bound, face rigid, almost carved in its immobility. She stepped aside, gesturing him inside, her hospitality delivered more as duty than kindness. He recognized her instantly from the stories Delilah Ballard. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of smoke, dried herbs, and the raw, earthy scent of isolation. Three enormous men sat near the fire, so tall that even seated, they towered over Toiver. Their eyes followed him with a cold intensity, scanning, assessing, but revealing nothing of thought or intent. Delilah introduced them as her sons, Ezra, Amos, and Silas, though the brothers acknowledged neither her introduction nor Toiver's presence beyond subtle movements of their heads. Their sheer size, combined with the fluid grace of their movements, made them seem less like humans than embodiments of some mountain legend. Delilah offered a simple meal of venison and cornbread, her voice low, controlled, almost ritualistic. Conversation remained minimal. Toiver attempted small talk, met with curt, measured responses. He noted the obsessive display of religious devotion in the cabin, walls covered with carefully copied Bible verses, scripture pasted in meticulous order across every surface. It was a collage of devotion, yes, but also something more oppressive, more obsessive, an environment suffused with the weight of isolation and the singular world view Delilah instilled in her children. As the night deepened, Toiver lay on his bedroll, exhausted but unable to sleep. The wind howled outside, but beneath it, he noticed a faint, intermittent sound, a human sound, muffled but unmistakable. It rose and fell, blending with the storm, yet its source was clearly beneath the cabin. The crying of women, desperate and terrified, reached him through the floorboards. When he asked Delilah about the sounds, she explained with unhesitating conviction that he was hearing angels singing beneath the home, a blessing sent by the Lord to those living in righteousness and isolation. Her certainty, her complete absence of deception, conveyed a delusion so profound that Toiver realized he was dealing not with cunning deception, but with genuine religious mania, one that had shaped the lives of three men into instruments of her dark design. As the storm raged on, Reverend Toiver lay awake on his bedroll, listening intently. The muffled crying had a rhythm, a desperation that set his nerves on edge. He had spent years traveling the mountains, witnessing hardship and suffering, but the sound beneath the cabin suggested something far darker, something deliberate, hidden, and cruel. He waited until Delilah appeared to leave the cabin, moving toward the outhouse before cautiously rising to investigate. His eyes adjusted to the dim glow from the fire, and he began to examine the cabin floor near the far wall. There, partially concealed beneath a heavy trunk, he noticed several floorboards fitted back into place with an almost obsessive precision. The gaps between them were slightly wider than the surrounding boards, enough for a careful eye to detect movement. Gently pressing down, he confirmed what he had feared. The boards shifted under his fingers. He waited, every muscle tensed, until Delilah's footsteps receded beyond the cabin. The moment felt suspended in time, the storm outside muffling both sound and urgency. Toiver moved the trunk aside, exposing the hidden boards fully. With great effort he lifted them, revealing a wooden ladder descending into absolute darkness. The smell that rose from below was immediate and unmistakable: human waste, unwashed bodies, and an intangible stench of fear, so thick it seemed to press against the throat. Candle stub in hand, he descended into the limestone beneath the cabin, aware that any misstep could be fatal. Each rung creaked under his weight, echoing in the cavern like a whisper of impending revelation. The cave expanded as he moved downward, the space artificially widened in places, suggesting deliberate modification rather than natural formation alone. The darkness pressed against the flame, swallowing it in moments, but the candle revealed what he had dreaded most: 3 women, chained to iron rings driven into the rock walls. They cowered, trembling, raising arms instinctively to defend against a threat that had long dominated their lives. Their clothing was tattered remnants of traveling garments, their bodies emaciated, eyes hollow from weeks of captivity. The youngest seemed 19, the oldest perhaps 28. Their voices emerged in fragments, hoarse from disuse, but the essential facts were clear. Sarah Pewitt, from Floyd County, explained that she had been traveling to her sister's home in Virginia when 3 enormous men, seemingly simple and harmless, offered to guide her along a shorter path. She had accepted, unaware that this act would lead her into confinement. The brothers, coordinated and precise, had restrained her swiftly, leaving no opportunity for escape. Similar accounts, offered in broken sentences and fearful gestures, revealed that the other women had met comparable fates, each drawn away from familiar paths and trapped by the same terrifying method. Toiver realized the full scope of Delilah's design. The mother had raised her sons in isolation, teaching them scripture twisted into justification, instilling in them a deluded belief that their actions were righteous. Their enormous physical presence, honed by labor and isolation, made them nearly unstoppable, and their synchronization with one another suggested an almost unnatural unity. Delilah's obsession with divine destiny had turned into a horrific breeding program, targeting women under the guise of religious guidance, shaping her sons into instruments of her deranged vision. As the candle flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, Toiver understood the peril. The women's lives hung by a thread, and he alone now knew the truth hidden beneath Copperhead Hollow. Any misstep, any noise, could alert the Ballards to his intrusion, dooming both himself and the captives to untold suffering. Yet he could not ignore what he had discovered. Action was inevitable, though the path forward remained as treacherous as the mountains themselves. Toiver crouched in the darkness of the limestone cave, the candle's flame flickering against the rough stone walls. The women huddled together, trembling, their chains biting into raw skin, eyes wide with fear and confusion. He spoke softly, careful not to alarm them further, reassuring them that he was not one of their captors. Their whispers emerged hesitantly, revealing the horrors of weeks spent in captivity, the precise coordination of the brothers, the strict, ritualized routines imposed by Delilah, and the constant threat of violence that hung over every movement. The preacher's mind raced as he absorbed the details, understanding both the gravity of the situation and the peril that surrounded them. The Ballard triplets, despite their immense size and strength, were not malicious in a conventional sense. They acted under the influence of their mother's delusions. Delilah had convinced them that their actions were righteous, a divine mandate to restore an ancient bloodline. Every lesson, every word of scripture drilled into them emphasized obedience to God and family, and this twisted interpretation justified the abduction and restraint of the women in their minds. Toiver realized that confronting the men directly would be suicidal. They were physically unstoppable, and any sudden movement might provoke violence. Careful planning, subtlety, and timing would be the only means of achieving escape. The first challenge was concealment. The candle's light was barely sufficient to navigate the narrow tunnel, and the women's weakened states required support. Toiver instructed them to remain low, moving only when he indicated, and to keep quiet no matter what sounds approached from above. The smell in the cave was overwhelming, a mixture of unwashed bodies, human waste, and the pervasive stench of fear. Yet the preacher's resolve did not waver. He knew the only way to survive, and to save these women, was to maintain composure and act with precision. He also needed information. Speaking softly, he gathered names, approximate timelines, and the methods the brothers used to control and transport captives. Each detail painted a picture of a family operating with meticulous care, exploiting the isolation of Copperhead Hollow and the treacherous terrain surrounding it. The sisters, Sarah Pewitt and the other two, described how supplies were delivered regularly by Delilah, and how the brothers responded almost instinctively to her commands. Every step, every action was dictated by the mother's vision, an unwavering delusion that turned a remote hollow into a fortress of suffering. Above ground, the storm continued its assault. Snow piled high against the cabin, obscuring footprints and masking noise. Toiver could hear faint creaks and shifts as the Ballard brothers moved above him, their synchronization unmistakable even through the thick floorboards. He noted each pattern, their timing, their movements, the way they spoke to each other in low, almost musical cadences, and how they checked the hollow for intrusions. Any sudden sound or misstep could alert them, endangering the women and himself. Toiver spent the night planning the next steps, considering the mountain's terrain, the limited visibility, and the sheer size and awareness of the brothers. He had to devise a strategy to lead the women out without detection, using the storm as both shield and distraction. Each decision carried the weight of life or death, and the preacher understood that hesitation could be fatal. Yet, despite the terror and exhaustion, he resolved that he would not leave the hollow without bringing them to safety. By dawn, the storm had not lessened, and Toiver's preparation became urgent. He moved quietly to reposition the candle, observing the women's chains and the structure of the hidden tunnel. Escape was possible, but only if every detail, timing, silence, coordination, was perfect. The Ballard triplets would return soon, and with them, the fragile veil of secrecy that had cloaked their crimes for years. The dim light of Toiver's candle cast long, trembling shadows along the cave walls as he prepared the women for the first cautious move. Their chains had left raw, angry marks across wrists and ankles, and each step required care to avoid reopening wounds or creating noise that could alert the Ballard triplets above. Toiver moved with deliberate precision, whispering instructions, testing the tunnel's stability, and marking subtle landmarks to guide their escape. Every sense was heightened, the howling wind above, the distant creaks of the cabin floor. Even the rhythm of his own heartbeat became a warning system in the silence. The women obeyed with the cautious compliance of the long imprisoned. Sarah Pewitt, the most coherent among them, led her companions in soft murmurs, echoing Toiver's instructions. They moved slowly, sliding across the stone where possible, supporting one another, never raising their voices. The preacher relied on the natural sound of the storm to mask movement, timing each step to coincide with gusts of wind or the heavy fall of snow against the roof. It was a delicate ballet of life and death, conducted in near-total darkness, with each misstep potentially catastrophic. Above them, the Ballard triplets' presence was a constant, unnerving reminder of the danger. Though the floorboards dampened the sound of their movements, the preacher could sense them. 3 enormous forms, moving with uncanny coordination, speaking in low, rhythmic murmurs that seemed almost musical. Years of isolation and maternal instruction had honed their senses. Any disturbance could trigger a response that might reach the cave in seconds. Toiver knew that the brothers' strength made confrontation impossible. Subtlety, cunning, and patience were the only weapons he possessed. As they progressed, Toiver noted the meticulous nature of the cave modifications. Small alcoves for supplies, niches carved to store provisions, and false walls that concealed portions of the hollow demonstrated the extent of Delilah's obsessive planning. The path twisted and narrowed in ways that demanded careful navigation, but it also offered cover, hiding them from any accidental view through cracks above. The preacher moved at the pace dictated by the women's fragile condition, knowing that haste could break their courage or draw attention. The storm outside served both as shield and enemy. While its fury masked the faint sounds of their movement, it also made the terrain treacherous. Footing on snow-covered rock was precarious. A single slip could result in injury or noise that carried far above. Toiver adjusted each step, testing surfaces with his staff and supporting the women, taking extra care with the youngest, whose strength had been diminished by weeks of captivity. Despite the peril, there was also a growing sense of momentum. The women, initially trembling and unsteady, began to match Toiver's rhythm, learning to move with the shadows and the storm as allies. Their whispered encouragements to one another blended with the preacher's guidance, creating a fragile harmony against the oppressive weight of the hollow above. Every creak, every breath, became part of an intricate code, a choreography of survival that demanded absolute focus. By mid-morning, the group had covered a considerable distance into the limestone tunnels, moving deeper into areas less likely to be observed by anyone above. The preacher paused, crouching to examine the path ahead. He mapped the twists, noting exit points, and prepared for the next phase, the moment when they would ascend toward freedom, risking exposure to the triplets' vigilance above. It was a step that would require all their courage, and Toiver steeled himself, knowing that the mountain's silence was both friend and enemy in the hours to come. The tunnel ahead twisted sharply, narrowing to a jagged passage that rose toward the surface. Toiver crouched low, guiding the women, aware that the slightest misstep could echo up through the floorboards and alert the Ballard triplets above. The candle flickered violently in the gusts that seeped through the cracks, casting grotesque shadows on the walls and making every movement seem larger than it was. The women's whispers were taut with fear, each breath shallow, each step measured with precision born of weeks of terror. A sudden sound from above froze them in place. The heavy creak of floorboards shifted their hearts into their throats. Toiver pressed the women into the shadows, the candle low, its flame almost extinguished by the draft. Footsteps moved across the cabin above, deliberate and synchronized, unmistakably the triplets. They had returned earlier than expected, perhaps drawn by instinct or the need to check the hollow. Toiver counted each step mentally, noting the rhythm, 1, 2, 3, then pause, repeat. The brothers' coordination was near perfect, the subtle shifts of weight and sound revealing their uncanny awareness of the space around them. Holding their breath, the women shrank closer to the walls. The preacher felt the raw panic in their bodies, the tension that made them tremble despite his silent reassurances. He reminded them, in whispers, that stillness was their only protection. One wrong movement, one gasp, could end their escape before it began. The steps above passed directly over the area where they had paused, and Toiver felt the vibration through the stone beneath them, a pulse of the immense power lurking above. Minutes passed like hours. Then, gradually, the sound of movement retreated, the heavy rhythm fading as the brothers moved back toward the main room. Toiver waited, counting long seconds beyond what seemed necessary, until absolute silence enveloped them again. Only then did he signal the women to move, inch by careful inch, up the jagged slope toward the first hint of daylight that filtered through cracks in the limestone. The path was narrow, forcing them into a single file, hands pressed against rough stone to avoid stumbling. Every rock, every ridge was scrutinized before they shifted their weight, each step a delicate negotiation between speed and stealth. The women's exhaustion was almost total. Their muscles had atrophied from confinement, their bodies weakened by malnutrition, and yet fear lent them an almost supernatural vigilance. Toiver guided them with steady hands, murmuring encouragement, noting landmarks in the stone to maintain orientation. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, but its roaring wind became an ally, masking faint noises as they drew closer to the hidden exit. A sudden sharp crack echoed through the passage, sending hearts racing. A loose rock had shifted under one of the women's feet. Toiver froze, gripping her shoulder, and held her in place. The sound did not carry upward, thanks to the hollow's acoustics, and slowly, carefully, he continued, reinforcing each step with caution. Every movement became a negotiation with gravity, sound, and the ever-present threat above. Finally, a faint light appeared ahead, a pale wash of gray signaling the entrance to the surface. Toiver paused, inhaling the frigid, clean air that mingled with the lingering stench of the cave. The exit was near, but freedom was not yet assured. Above, the Ballard's senses remained formidable. Below, the women's fragile strength demanded careful pacing. The final stretch would test nerves, skill, and courage in equal measure, and Toiver knew that one error could undo weeks of careful planning and the precarious progress they had made toward escape. The tree line rose ahead, dark and dense against the snow-whipped gray of Copperhead Hollow, a natural barrier promising concealment and a measure of safety. Toiver led the women toward it, knees stiff from crawling and climbing, lungs burning from exertion, but determination lending them a strength they had not known in weeks. The storm remained a fierce companion, masking the faint noises of their movement, yet demanding constant vigilance. Every step, every careful placement of foot on hidden rocks or frozen earth could determine whether they would live to see the outside world. As they approached the forest, the hollow's cliffs loomed above, imposing walls of limestone that had once trapped them within its deadly embrace. The preacher kept the women low, guiding them through snowdrifts and under fallen branches, whispering directions in urgent, calm tones. Their progress slowed, not from fear, but from the fragility of bodies weakened by captivity, each step requiring the balance of caution and speed. Sarah Pewitt, though exhausted, took the lead in silent determination, signaling obstacles and guiding the other women behind her. Above, the Ballard triplets continued their patrols in the cabin and surrounding areas. Though still massive and capable, their senses, honed through years of isolation and maternal instruction, could not penetrate the storm's fury or anticipate every natural concealment. Toiver had calculated the timing, the hidden depressions, and the rhythm of the giants' patrols, moving in harmony with the wind and the snow to evade detection. Every creak of a branch, every crunch of snow underfoot, was measured against the storm's masking roar. The women's strength faltered as they neared the first dense patch of pines. Toiver encouraged them quietly, offering support, distributing what little warmth remained in shared clothing, and keeping their spirits tethered to the singular goal of survival. Each tree became a shield, each shadow a cloak, each snow-laden branch a barrier against prying eyes. He directed them in small, deliberate movements, whispering cues and marking subtle landmarks that could prevent disorientation in the near-whiteout conditions. The forest floor was treacherous. Hidden roots, slick patches of ice, and snow-covered crevices threatened every step. Toiver tested each surface before placing weight on it, leading by example and caution. The women followed closely, trusting him completely, their bodies trembling from fatigue but hearts emboldened by the tangible sense of progress. Each yard gained brought them farther from Copperhead Hollow, farther from Delilah Ballard and her monstrous sons, and closer to the promise of life beyond captivity. Occasionally, they paused in the protective shadow of massive pines, listening intently. The storm's howl mingled with distant echoes from the hollow below, perhaps the triplets, perhaps only the wind, but Toiver's vigilance never wavered. He understood that the Ballard's awareness, while formidable, could be deceived by natural elements. Snow, fog, and darkness were his allies, and the women's adherence to his guidance was their lifeline. Hours passed in this delicate, measured march through the forest. The first signs of the outside world, broken terrain, lighter snow cover, distant sounds of flowing water forced the hope building in the women's hearts. The hollow, with its vertical cliffs, hidden caves, and oppressive shadows, receded behind them, a prison of terror left at last beneath the storm's chaos. Though still weak and trembling, the women were moving into open space, into the possibility of freedom, and the storm itself, once an adversary, had become the instrument of their survival. At last, the forest thinned, giving way to a rugged expanse of snow, dusted hills and jagged rocks, a natural transition from the hollow's suffocating cliffs to the broader wilderness beyond. Toiver led the women into a shallow depression near a cluster of bent pines, their limbs heavy with frost. Here, the storm's fury was still present but less overwhelming, and for the first time in weeks, the women could pause without fear of immediate discovery. Their bodies sagged with exhaustion, muscles trembling from cold and strain, but their hearts lifted at the realization that they had survived the hollow itself. Toiver quickly assessed their condition. Hands and faces were red and raw from the storm, legs stiff from crawling and climbing, and clothing inadequate against the mountain's relentless cold. He instructed the women to huddle together for warmth, sharing layers where possible, while he used his own coat as additional protection. Every movement was measured to conserve strength and prevent injury. In silence, he studied the surrounding terrain, planning the safest route toward the settlements beyond Breath County, mindful that the Ballard triplets could still be searching above or tracking from a distance. The women whispered quietly, their voices low, fragile fragments of speech that revealed both terror and relief. Sarah Pewitt recounted small details of her captivity, offering the preacher insight into how long the Ballards had held them, the daily routines imposed by Delilah, and the horrifying precision with which the brothers executed their mother's commands. Toiver listened intently, noting patterns that might aid in avoiding further encounters. He realized that the mother's delusions had instilled obedience in her sons that bordered on religious fanaticism. They truly believed their actions were righteous, that their victims were instruments of a divine plan. This belief had allowed them to commit unspeakable acts without hesitation or doubt, a dangerous conviction amplified by isolation and their unnatural size. Despite their weakened state, the women responded to Toiver's calm guidance. Every whispered instruction, when to move, how to navigate slippery patches, where to find temporary shelter behind rock outcroppings, reinforced their fragile confidence. The storm's masking presence, combined with the natural cover of the hills and trees, created a protective corridor through which they could cautiously advance. For the first time, the preacher allowed himself a small measure of hope. They had survived the cave, evaded detection by the triplets, and emerged into open wilderness where, with careful navigation, the risk of encounter decreased. Each step was still perilous, yet the women's spirits were buoyed by the tangible progress. Snow-covered hills stretched before them, unbroken by cliffs or hidden traps, offering a path toward inhabited lands. Toiver reminded himself that vigilance remained essential. Even with the hollow behind them, the mountains were treacherous, and exposure, hypothermia, or misstep could still claim lives. He also understood the importance of morale. Instilling hope in the women was as crucial as guiding them through the storm. He encouraged small victories, moving from one depression to the next, navigating around jagged rocks, making it to a sheltered grove. Each success reinforced courage and renewed strength, preparing them for the journey still ahead toward Jackson and the first signs of human presence. As the storm began to ease slightly, the group settled for a brief respite. Snow swirled around them in eddies, a protective veil that concealed their location, while Toiver silently mapped the next phase of their escape. The hollow and its horrors were behind them, yet freedom still demanded every ounce of strength, every careful decision, and the unbroken resolve to survive until the first signs of civilization appeared on the horizon. The outer hills stretched before them like a frozen labyrinth, ridges and valleys carved by centuries of wind and water, coated in snow that obscured footing and disguised hidden dangers. Toiver led the women in a careful zigzag pattern, staying low where the terrain allowed, using every dip and rise as cover. Each step was a test of endurance, balance, and vigilance. One miscalculation could send them tumbling into a concealed crevasse or reveal them to the Ballard triplets, should they have returned in search. The women's exhaustion was palpable. Limbs ached, Backs throbbed from weeks of confinement, and muscles protested with every motion. Yet fear lent them a fragile resilience, a sharpened instinct to follow Toiver's precise guidance. They moved slowly, deliberately, pausing whenever the wind's roar abated, listening for sounds above or around them. A snapping branch, a shifting snowdrift, the faintest echo of movement, all demanded attention. Toiver's experience in the mountains guided every decision, but the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him. The lives of 3 fragile women were now in his hands. The wind bit through their clothing, driving fine snow into faces and eyes. Toiver signaled for the group to take short, low breaths, conserving energy while avoiding heavy exhalations that might carry through the hollow. Their progress was methodical, almost imperceptible to any observer, yet each yard gained was a triumph against both nature and the looming threat of the Ballards. The preacher occasionally glanced back, scanning the snowy ridges for movement, confirming that no shadow followed, no massive figure patrolled from above. Every glance was a reminder of how close they had come to disaster in the hollow and how delicate their current safety remained. As they pressed on, Toiver noticed subtle landmarks. A jagged rock formation that resembled a leaning tower, a twisted pine bending under the weight of ice, and a small frozen stream cutting through the valley floor. He used these natural markers to navigate and to orient the women, giving them something tangible to follow when their strength faltered. Sarah Pewitt and the others clung to each cue, whispering brief confirmations and adjusting their path to avoid pitfalls hidden beneath snow. The sense of pursuit lingered, though no direct signs appeared. Toiver understood the Ballard triplets' skills. Their incredible size, speed, and awareness, honed by years of isolation, could make them formidable trackers even in the storm's chaos. He maintained constant vigilance, frequently stopping the group in shallow depressions to scan the ridges, noting every sound and shadow. The women's fear was both a danger and a motivator. Too much panic could collapse morale, but awareness kept them alert and cautious, reinforcing the necessity of measured movement. Hours passed. Fatigue threatened to overwhelm them, yet the preacher's steady presence, whispered instructions, and careful pacing carried them forward. The storm began to ease slightly, snow falling more gently, revealing the contours of the ridges and valleys. Toiver recognized the subtle signs of civilization: smoke curling from a distant chimney, the faint outlines of a farmstead beyond the next ridge. The sight, though small and distant, renewed hope, reminding the women that the hollow and its horrors were no longer inescapable shadows behind them. They were moving toward life, human contact, and sanctuary. Every movement now carried an urgency tempered by caution. The final stretch through the outer hills demanded continued focus as the possibility of exposure remained real. Yet with the hollow receding, the storm easing, and the first signs of settlement appearing on the horizon, a fragile optimism began to take root in their hearts. The first signs of human habitation loomed ahead, a thin wisp of smoke curling from a distant chimney, the faint outline of a cluster of log cabins partially obscured by the remaining snow. Toiver's heart lifted, but he remained cautious, aware that the Ballard triplets' awareness could extend beyond the hollow. Every step forward demanded vigilance, every motion measured. The women, though trembling with fatigue, followed with renewed determination, each breath a fragile promise of freedom. The path to the settlement was uneven, littered with hidden rocks and slippery ice patches. Toiver led the women along depressions and behind snow-laden pines, using natural cover to mask their approach. Even now, months of captivity and abuse weighed heavily on their bodies. Limbs ached, joints stiffened, and hunger gnawed at them. He whispered encouragement, carefully monitoring their pace to avoid collapse or injury. Survival depended on both caution and the fragile reserves of strength each carried. As they neared the outskirts of the settlement, movement in the distance caught Toiver's attention. A lone figure traversed the snowy landscape, bundled against the storm's remnants, appearing to head toward the cabins. The preacher froze, signaling the women to stay low, and analyzed the figure. Relief surged when he realized it was a local farmer making his way along the usual route. This meant the Hollow's secrets were still hidden. The Ballard triplets had not pursued them beyond their domain, leaving the storm and wilderness as the only obstacles they had faced. Slowly, methodically, the group moved closer to the nearest cabin. Toiver instructed the women to stay behind him, offering a protective presence as he guided them past fences and small outbuildings. Their bodies were nearly spent, yet the proximity of human habitation infused them with courage. Every careful step diminished the isolation that had defined the past months, every muted sound of domestic life. The clatter of tools, the bark of a dog reminded them that they were nearing safety. Finally, they reached the edge of the cleared area. Toiver called out softly to the farmer, explaining their situation in hushed urgency. The women remained hidden until help could be confirmed, their trust in the preacher absolute. The farmer quickly recognized the danger and guided them toward a safe structure, a small cabin prepared to offer shelter, warmth, and protection. Relief washed over them, the first genuine sense of security they had felt since captivity began. Inside the cabin, fires were stoked, coarse blankets spread, and simple food offered. The women collapsed, exhausted beyond comprehension, trembling as warmth seeped into their frozen limbs. Toiver remained vigilant, listening for any distant signs of pursuit, but none came. Copperhead Hollow and its horrors remained behind them, the Ballard triplets confined to their isolated domain, unaware that their control had been broken. In the hours that followed, the women began to recount fragments of their ordeal, weeks of confinement, the oppressive presence of the triplets, Delilah's fanatical teachings, and the unrelenting fear that had defined every day. Their stories were incomplete, disjointed by trauma and weakness, yet Toiver recorded every detail, understanding their importance. The community would need to know, the authorities would need evidence, and most importantly, the victims themselves needed their experiences acknowledged. Though the journey out of the Hollow was complete, the path to justice and recovery had only just begun. The mountains would always hold the memory of Copperhead Hollow, the legend of the Ballard triplets, and the horrors committed in isolation. But for the first time, the women knew they had survived, and with careful guidance, they would reclaim their lives beyond the shadows of the Hollow. The women's return to civilization marked the beginning of an arduous journey beyond the Hollow's shadows. Word of their escape spread quickly through Breath County, carried first by the farmer who had aided Toiver, and then by travelers and local authorities. Sheriff Nathaniel Cumbez was immediately notified, and he began the painstaking process of documenting the women's accounts, comparing their descriptions with the long-standing pattern of disappearances traced to the vicinity of Copperhead Hollow. Each fragment of testimony added to the growing picture of a dark legacy. The horrifying orchestration of Delilah Ballard and her triplet sons laid bare at last. Delilah Ballard's delusion was revealed in chilling clarity. She had convinced her sons that they were biblical giants, chosen to restore an ancient bloodline, and that their actions were divinely sanctioned. The twisted doctrine she imposed made restraint, cruelty, and domination not only permissible but necessary. Her obsessive copying of Scripture, her isolation of the boys from the world, and her insistence on absolute obedience created a family unit both extraordinary and horrifying in its unity. The mountain's remoteness and the natural dangers of Copperhead Hollow had hidden their crimes for decades, masking disappearances as accidents, and delaying the community's understanding until a pattern emerged that no one could ignore. Sheriff Cumbez, guided by the women's accounts and the testimony of Reverend Toiver, organized a careful investigation. Search parties were dispatched to the Hollow, uncovering the hidden cave systems, the carved floorboards, and evidence of confinement. While some victims were still unaccounted for, the discovery of those held captive confirmed the worst suspicions, and the community finally understood the magnitude of what had occurred. Copperhead Hollow, a place of fog, cliffs, and whispered legend, became known as a site of real horror rather than mere folklore. The women were cared for by the local community, provided with warmth, nourishment, and the beginnings of recovery. Physical healing came slowly, the psychological scars lingered longer, etched by fear, isolation, and cruelty, yet their survival was a testament to resilience and courage, to the careful guidance of Reverend Toiver, and to the mercy of circumstance in the midst of a brutal winter storm. Each day beyond the hollow represented a small reclaiming of life stolen by fanaticism and violence. Delilah and her sons were pursued but eluded immediate capture, the rugged terrain favoring those who knew its secrets intimately. Over time, legal authorities and local guides mapped the hollow's complexities, but the shadow of the Ballards lingered in regional memory. Copperhead Hollow became both a cautionary tale and a historical horror, its story preserved in the collective consciousness of Breath County and the surrounding mountains. The legend of the Ballard triplets and their mother endured because of meticulous accounts, survivor testimony, and the unwavering courage of those who risked their own lives to confront the horrors hidden in isolation. For the community, for the women who survived, and for the memory of those lost, Copperhead Hollow's story would never fade. It became a dark testament to the danger of fanaticism, the consequences of extreme isolation, and the resilience of the human spirit when guided by courage and compassion. Though the mountains remained as wild and forbidding as ever, the shadow of the Ballard family was finally diminished, their crimes exposed, and the women's voices, once silenced beneath limestone and snow, heard at last. The hollow would always carry its secrets, but now the world knew the truth, and the victims were remembered.